Today we begin our unit on China, and lots of stuff to learn about China. A lot of it has to do with its geography. The geography of China helps to make China very isolated, and because of that they are able to develop a very unique culture. The belief for the Chinese was that China was the center of the earth, and that civilization that initially grows in China is going to have that belief, and that helps to determine how the Chinese view themselves and how they view the rest of the world as well. So why is the geography of China making it so isolated? Well, on the western part of China you have the Himalayan mountains and deserts, so very difficult to cross. In the south there's a lot of jungles, and again, difficult to get through, and that's going to prevent them from being attacked and that kind of stuff. And on the east you had the ocean, and not very many seafaring people are going to encounter China until much later into their history. So all of these things are going to help keep China somewhat isolated, and they're able to really develop as their own separate culture. The first civilizations in China will develop along the river valleys, most of them along the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. There's many other rivers in China, but the major civilizations will develop along these two, the Yellow and the Yangtze. And again, river valley civilizations begin and develop because of irrigation, transportation, trade, a food source. All that kind of stuff is important along the river valleys. Like I said, China is going to be somewhat isolated, and it has a creation myth, or an idea of how they came about. And the Chinese creation myth is about Pangu, and Pangu was the first man, and the first man lived for 18,000 years according to Chinese tradition. And as people do, as you grow older, you grow bigger, right? You start from a tiny baby and you grow to adulthood. Well, Pangu continued growing even past adulthood, and so if he lived for 18,000 years, he becomes very, very large, and so he becomes the world, and that's because his body kept growing. Eventually, the Lord of Man will come to live on Pangu, and he's going to solve man's problems and basic needs like clothing and food and shelter and how you can gain these things. From the creation myth, we get the 5 principles of Chinese society, what they value in their society. So we're going to talk about the 5 principles. The first is integrity of government. So integrity just means that it's honest, it's true, it's trustworthy. So the integrity of government is the first principle of the Chinese society. This is what they value. They value the integrity of the government. They want it to be uncorrupted. The second is love of family, and so you're going to see a lot of things that deal with keeping the family name and the family tradition. The third is knowledge of your place in society, where you stand in relation to other people, in terms of economics, in terms of social classes. All that kind of stuff is going to come into play. The fourth value is a respect for your elders, and there is a lot more respect among the Chinese for their elder population than there is in like today's society, in American society. We don't tend to respect our elders as much as, say, the Chinese do. And the fifth is a loyalty among friends, that there's, once you give your word and you are in a pact with someone, that's what you stick to. You have loyalty among your friends. So we're going to look at the first few Chinese dynasties. A dynasty is where it's one family who's in charge. So the first dynasty is called the Jia dynasty. During this dynasty, we get things introduced like the wheel and domesticated animals and bronze as a metal. They continuously begin to cultivate along the rivers because of the farming that's available. In fact, the Jia dynasty was first thought to be a part of mythology, that it was part of the Pangu, Lord of Man thing, but a lot of archaeological evidence has been found, especially like in 1959 they found the remains of what they thought might be the capital city of the Jia dynasty. So we can't prove particularly that it existed, but the next dynasty writes about the family before it, and so through that we can prove that there was a dynasty. At the end of the dynasty, what brings about the end of the dynasty is a man named Emperor Ji, and he was very corrupt, and because of that corruption, remember their first principle is the integrity of government. So when your government becomes corrupt, they get rid of it and get a new one. There's a rebellion that comes about. And that's going to bring in the Shang dynasty. Now, the Shang dynasty is going to control a small area of China. It's not very large, and in comparison to later dynasties, it's really not that big. But at the time, it was a good chunk of land to be in control of. And the Shang dynasty comes from the family of the Shang, and their god was Shang-Ti, who was the god of all heaven, and they worshiped their ancestors, that elderly, respect for the elderly kind of thing. So even the elderly past death, you respect your ancestors. They know more than you. They would sacrifice, especially right before major battles, in order to have their ancestors help them in battles and that kind of stuff. They would sacrifice both animals and humans, so they were kind of indiscriminatory that way. It's during the Shang dynasty that we get the idea of the yin and yang concept. And I know all of you have seen this symbol before, the circle that's half black and half white. And this is the symbol that represents yin and yang. What you probably don't know is what this all represents. So, yin is the black side of the circle, and it represents earth. And if you think about it, earth, soil is dark, so it represents darkness. And it also represents the female. Now, that doesn't mean that females are dark and nasty and all that kind of stuff. But think about what the soil produces, right? Things grow from the soil. Agriculture, farming, that kind of stuff. Women produce children. And so that's why it's related to that. The yang represents, if the yin represents earth, the opposite of that is heaven. So yang represents heaven. If yin is darkness, the yang represents light. And if yin is female, the yang represents male. So it seems like they're in opposition, but they're really not in opposition. Instead, it's more that you need to have both sides in order to have harmony. It allows for balance in the world. And that's why within each side, each half, you have a small dot of the other color. So within the black side, you have a small dot of white, and within the white side, you have a small dot of black. And the reason for that is because these two things cannot exist without each other. They are in harmony together. They work together. So some other things that the Shang dynasty will bring about: they had a calendar that was very, very accurate. Their writing is basically going to start the Chinese form of writing, because the form of writing used in the Shang dynasty is very, very similar to what's used today in China. So it basically stays the same throughout time. However, writing during the Shang dynasty was only for the priests and for the scholars. Most of the writing that is done during the Shang dynasty is done on things called oracle bones. And oracle bones would be not just bones, but maybe things like tortoise shells, the shoulder bones of large animals, and they would write on these things. And it was a way for the priests to ask questions of the ancestors or ask questions of the gods. It was a way to communicate and a way to foretell the future and get advice and that kind of stuff. In the Shang dynasty, emperors are considered to be the sons of heaven, that they have the blessings of the gods, but they are not gods themselves. So it's really different from other cultures that we've learned about that say that, oh, the person is the god, like the Egyptians, right? The pharaoh was the embodiment of the god on earth. Not so with the Chinese. They have the blessings of the gods, but they're not gods themselves. And so that's going to lead to the concept of mandate of heaven. What mandate of heaven says is that if your government is not doing its job, if your emperor is not doing his job, you can get rid of him. So if things are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, you have the right to rebel. Because if he's not doing his job, it means that the gods no longer bless him, that things are going bad because of that. And so if the gods no longer bless him, if they don't have the blessing of the gods, you should be able to get rid of them and find somebody new. Under the Shang dynasty, we also see slaves and women and ability become much more important. Slaves, they had slavery, but you could win your freedom, and you could also become more. You could become an advisor to the king or to the emperor. Women could become priests, and so women in the Shang dynasty were not entirely without power themselves. But towards the end of the dynasty, again, we see an emperor, Emperor Jin, who is going to be corrupt, and because of that corruption, mandate of heaven is going to be instituted, and that mandate of heaven is going to say we can overthrow you, we can get rid of you. So that is going to then bring in the Zhao dynasty, and the Zhao dynasty, the followers of the Shang-Ti, the god, are going to take over the Zhao dynasty because the god took away his blessing. So we get the Zhao dynasty, and they conquer and they burn down the palace, and they're going to change the kingship. It used to be that the emperor, if he died, it went to his brother, and they're going to change it that, well, if the emperor dies, it goes to his son instead. But they do keep a tie with the previous dynasty by marrying the Shang princesses. So the Zhao family comes in, and they marry the royal blood, the Shang princesses, in order to kind of keep it legal, that transition of power. They don't want to have a rival family, so they marry them into their family. The god Shang-Ti will be the same god that the Zhao dynasty is going to worship. They're just going to change the name to Tian. It's the same god, but a different name. It's under the Zhao dynasty that we see the introduction of feudalism, a feudal system. And that's where the land gets divided up into sections, and certain sections are going to belong to the government, and others, the peasants, are going to work. It's basically a pyramid of loyalty like what we saw in Europe. And this pyramid of loyalty, you have the emperor at the top and you have the poor people at the bottom, right? Well, it's a little bit tweaked with the Chinese. You have the emperor at the top, and normally it would be nobility that is next, but instead they're going to have inspectors are the next level, then the nobility, and then the peasants. Now this is a very strong structure because of the power distribution, that the nobles don't have quite so much power, so they can't influence things to their way as much as they could have done. But it's also a weak structure because if the emperor is weak, then the rest of it's going to be weak as well. So what's this level of inspectors? Well, they were basically spies. And they were supposed to spy on the nobility and make sure that they're not trying to take over the government and they're not skimming and that kind of stuff. Well, the problem with the inspectors is that if the emperor is weak, the inspector system is going to be weak as well, and so they could cause problems. They can take bribes, they can charge excessive taxes, they can take revenge. And so in order to prevent some of those problems, the emperors are going to institute basically like a crash course system to train inspectors to be above those kinds of things, to be trustworthy. Remember, we talked about how the first value, or the number one value, was integrity of government. Well, they're going to train these inspectors to have integrity, to be trustworthy. So they're going to have an extensive interview process. They're going to have to take classes, and so all of that you have to test in order to become an inspector, and it's really tough to do that. Well, eventually during the Zhao dynasty we have an axial age, and anytime that we have an axial age, it means that things are not going well, so they're looking for alternatives, a way to return back to the glory days, right? So we have warring states that are going to develop during the Zhao dynasty. The Zhao dynasty breaks apart. You have one side of the family that's going to be in control of the Eastern Zhao, and you have another side of the family that's going to be in control of the Western Zhao. And this civil war is going to break out, and you have two emperors, you have two court systems, they're both drafting armies, they're both building highways, they're both taxing, they're both claiming money for trade, all kinds of stuff. It just is a huge headache for the Chinese people. It's such a problem. And eventually they'll have a conference to end this civil war where they figure things out. And so instead of feudalism, they're instead going to go to a bureaucratic government, which means that they're going to divide it up into like different states or provinces that are going to have their own little areas. Within this bureaucratic government, you're going to have two concepts developed. The first is Li, L-I. Li, and Li is a code of conduct for the nobles on how they should behave in what they wear, and how they should behave in warfare, and how do they behave with other nobles, and what kind of jobs they can have. So this was a code of conduct for nobles. The second concept that develops during this Civil War period, or in the period right after, is Song Fa. And Song Fa is the law of kindred, basically that you become a noble by birth. So you're born into the nobility. It's not an appointment that every time you get a new emperor, they're saying, oh, you're going to be my nobles. And so you don't see this transition of power quite so much. Instead, it's going to be much more consistent. So Song Fa is a very important concept to have. Well, during this axial age, again, everybody's looking for ways to change things for the better, make things great again. And so you're going to have axial age thinkers. Now, most of the Chinese axial age thinkers are not talking about religion. In a lot of cases, axial age thinkers are thinking about religion. But in China, they're more worried about social order, of knowing one's place in society. Remember, number 3 in terms of the 5 principles. So knowing your place in society, where do you fit in? How does your life work? So some of the axial age thinkers that come during this time period is going to include Confucius, who comes up with this idea of Confucianism. Now, Confucius was the son of a noble, and he basically is going to look at the relationship structure of, in order to create harmony, yin and yang, right? So creating harmony, the 5 relationships. And in these 5 relationships, you have one part of the relationship is superior or more dominant than the inferior part of the relationship. And he said everybody has these relationships. So what are these relationships? Well, you have father to son. Father is the superior, son is the inferior, and the son owes his loyalty and obedience to the father. The next relationship is emperor to subject. So the emperor is superior and the subject is inferior. And again, the subject owes his loyalty and obedience to the emperor. The next is husband to wife, and the husband is the superior and the wife is in the inferior, and she owes her loyalty and obedience to the husband. The 4th relationship is older sibling to younger sibling. Remember, family, love of family. Family is very important. And so the younger sibling owes their loyalty and obedience to the older sibling. And the 5th relationship is about friends. And basically this idea is that usually there's a dominant and an inferior, a superior and inferior, but not always. And if there isn't, the idea of the golden rule sort of applies, that you do unto others as you would have done unto you. It's more of an equal footing for the most part. Confucius also talked about education, and he felt that the more education you had, the higher up in society you should be, because you're more knowledgeable, you can bring more to the plate kind of thing. And so for him, for education, scholars should be the most sought after people, followed by peasants, because peasants have to know a lot. You know, they don't have just one job. They have to know how to do everything in order to survive, because a peasant has to know how to make their own food. They have to know how to make their own clothing. They have to know how to farm. They have to know how to do livestock. They have to know stuff about money. They have to know a lot of things about a lot of things. And so he felt peasants should be very, very important as well. After that, then it's the artisans, people who specialize in a certain craft, and then the merchants at the bottom, because they just sell other people's work. And so for Confucius, this gives you a lot of social mobility that you can, the more education you get, the more you can move up in that. You can change to different jobs, and everyone is born good and equal, and you can become anything you want. And so it provides hope. And the hope is that if you become educated, you move up in society. So that's part of Confucianism as well. Now, like I said, Confucianism is not a religion, so it doesn't really deal with the afterlife. It doesn't talk about what happens to you after you die. It's more concerned with the life you are living now. Confucius himself said, if you don't understand life, how on earth can you possibly understand death? And so that's why he focuses on life. He also says that laws should really be unnecessary, that people should live by example, that how you want people to behave is how you should live, and your example would be good for others. You don't need laws to regulate. If they see what society expects, then you shouldn't need to have laws. And he also felt that mandate of heaven was a good thing, that it's your moral duty to obey. because of that relationship structure he talked about. But if your emperor is not doing his job, if he's not doing what he's supposed to do, you can still get rid of him. You can find a new superior in the relationship. So that's Confucianism. Another axial age thinker is Lao Tse, and he comes up with the idea of Taoism. And again, Lao Tse was a nobleman, and so he comes up with this idea of Taoism. Taoism, a good way to describe it is like the way of how things should be. He talks a lot about being like water, that if you have a stream that is flowing, water flows, it changes with the times, right? Depending on the season. Sometimes it could be frozen, sometimes it's flooded, and sometimes it's dry and just barely a trickle, but it changes with the times. But it never allows anything to completely stop it. That you should be like water. You should go around the obstacles rather than batter against it all the time. That you learn to change with the times. You achieve inner harmony and peace by not being in conflict. And so he really talks about the yin and yang, having balance. Balance is part of that inner harmony and peace, that if you have that balance, that's good. He also talks about the folk beliefs, the peasant beliefs of animism, that everything has a living spirit, and so you should treat everything with that in mind, that you don't abuse anything. Another group of axial age thinkers are called the legalists, and the legalists were led by Han Fei. And Han Fei, with the legalism basically believes that people are born bad, that you need to have very strict laws with harsh punishments in order to keep you in control, to provide structure and order. Now, after the Zhao dynasty, the next dynasty is going to use that as the basis for their law and rule. They're going to be very, really gung-ho after people, like you can't break the law, and if you do, you're going to suffer for it. So they really buy into this whole legalist idea. But there's others, like Confucianism would not agree with Han Fei at all. Confucius would say that that's not the right way. The next group are the Mohists, and they're created by Mo Tzu. He is a peasant, and he is going to basically, Mohists think that things should be based on ability. That just because you're born a noble doesn't mean you're really noble. That you have more ability, or that you are great for a job just because you're born as a noble. So it is going to emphasize self-reflection. It's going to emphasize authenticity, that you truly are good at math, or you're truly good at taxes or writing, not just because your parents were. It's because of your own ability. So self-reflection, authenticity, rather than obedience to ritual, that you're conforming. Just because your parents were artists doesn't mean that you are going to be an artist. Maybe you're going to be a farmer and you're excellent at farming because that's what your ability is. And so that's what Mohists are about. And then finally you have occultists. And occultists believe in magic, the magical properties of things, and astrology, and the stars can tell you. And so you get the Chinese zodiac that comes from this. And so the Chinese still do a lot with occultism today. They're very concerned about what year you're born in, because every year has a different animal, and that animal symbolizes something about you. And so you get all these different axial age thinkers that are looking at how can we make life better. Like I said, none of them are religions. It's all about social order.